Thanks, Jeanette.
Thank you, Jeanette, and Nonprofit Pathways for having us here today. My name is Tamiko Ambrose Murray, and as Jeanette said, I am a community-based researcher and an arts educator. And I have been on the board of Asheville City Schools Foundation for around 4 years. And part of how I came to be on the board is because I was very interested in the work that they were doing to bring a racial equity lens to their organization's work. And so I, many years ago, was in New Orleans after Katrina, and I think that what I witnessed and what I experienced there in talking to some of the residents kind of shifted the way I viewed the world. I was not able to look at the world in the same way. And I think at the time I didn't have the language to describe what I was witnessing, but I began to have an inkling that there was more to race than I was taught. And I think that that is what drew me into this work. And I'm on a lifelong journey. And I'm really excited to be here with you all today.
Thanks, Tamiko. Good afternoon. My name is Kate Pett. I'm the Executive Director of the Asheville City Schools Foundation. And we want to find out, just check in really quickly if people can hear us. You can go ahead and reply to the chat function if you're having any problem hearing the conversation. So I want to start by acknowledging that I am a learner as a white woman on this journey to understanding the larger systems of structural racism and my personal privilege as a white woman. I'm presenting today not as an expert, but as a co-learner with my staff and my fellow board members and with all of you who seek to enhance social justice by addressing inequities. I began my career in education as a teacher in the Detroit Public Schools, and I was also a teacher in the Asheville City Schools before joining the Asheville City Schools Foundation. It is my personal mission and that of the Asheville City Schools Foundation to achieve the full promise of public education to enhance equity. But when I started to really study our data on achievement, I learned how far our public schools are from achieving our grand mission. Rather than closing disparities, there is persistent achievement gap in our schools between white students and students of color. Initially, I assumed this was a problem related to poverty, but I have come to understand that there's something more at work. When we look closely at achievement data for children experiencing poverty, we see that white children living in poverty do better than children of color living in poverty. Children of color are experiencing a second layer of disadvantage. And that realization has led me to embrace this conversation that we're having today about structural racism as essential to improving outcomes for children of color and for all of our students. As we will talk about throughout this presentation, I accept that race cuts across all other issues of social justice. And for those of us in the social justice change business, we must specifically address and understand how race intersects with the issues in which we hope to affect change. We're going to get started by just overviewing what we're going to cover today. Talking about race and the barriers to equity is really challenging, and Tamiko and I have planned this webinar. And as we were going through it, we really wondered whether or not this format would suit such a complex and difficult topic. So we look forward to your feedback. In the 90 minutes, or now sort of 75-ish minutes we have left, we hope to present some common language and create a shared belief in the value of this important work for nonprofit boards. We want to talk about strategies for equity and share the story of the Asheville City Schools Foundation's journey. And we hope to help you plan your very first steps on the journey. And that's a lot to cover in the time we have. So like me, some of you will be impatient to get started on the topic, which is specifically inclusion and equity on nonprofit boards. However, race is such a complex topic that we often bring different definitions and frameworks to the conversation. And so for this reason, we can't move directly to speaking about board work. We have to begin by creating those common understandings and shared definitions. And this is going to take just a few minutes, but then we will dive right into talking specifically about our board work. And we do, as Jeanette said, have a plan to answer your questions at the end. So let's get started.
Great. So in order for us to talk about equity, as Kate said, we have to actually acknowledge the relationship between equity and race and racism. In order for us to begin this work to create the webinar for you all, we felt the need to come up with a set of operating assumptions to guide our work together. Talking about race and racism is a very difficult topic, and we acknowledge that. And we also acknowledge that people are entering the conversation with different levels of experience and different levels of exposure to the concepts that we're going to share with you today. But we do believe that people who are investing their time and energy and effort to participate in this webinar are doing so because they believe that all people should have access to what they need and that they want to make the world better. So our first operating assumption is that nonprofits participating today are seeking to make the world a better place to live in. The second assumption is that there are many different marginalized identities and many different ways that people experience oppression and many different ways of expressing diversity. So this is to say that in addition to race, there are other identities that experience oppression, and this would include in the area of ability, gender, religion, socioeconomic status, language, age. There's so many different areas, but if a person belongs to one of these marginalized identities and is also a person of color, as they say, it's both it could be a double jeopardy or a triple jeopardy. So we acknowledge that through our analysis. Thirdly, we are presenting to organizations that are seeking to address inequities and to work towards social justice. And as I said, race always matters with every issue, no matter what issue that your organization is seeking to address. And so this could include housing, healthcare, education, environment, arts access, poverty, whatever issue, race always matters. So there are many reasons that nonprofit leaders are looking more deeply at diversity, inclusion, and equity, and what it means within the context of their organizations and their areas of work. And so many people are asking the question of what it looks like to bring equity into your work on the board. And also, a very prevalent question that I very often hear is, how can nonprofit boards recruit and retain board members that are representative of the groups being served? In order for Asheville City Schools Foundation to engage in this work as a board, we had to first adopt a shared language and a set of shared definitions that helped us to kind of frame these difficult conversations and to make sure that we have a shared understanding of what race and racism means. When we talk about racism, and at least I would say the way that I was raised, I was taught to believe that race and racism is limited to interpersonal relationships or how people interact with each other. And while individual and interpersonal levels of racism are a piece of structural racism, it's also important to acknowledge that it is only a piece, and we're going to go more deeply into what we mean when we say structural racism in just a moment. So the first definition that we share is this concept of race. We believe race is a social construct that was created to benefit white people while disadvantaging and disenfranchising people of color. And so while race is a social construct, the paradox is that racism is very real and causes a lot of harm to people of color through many of the areas that have been named already. Racial equity for us is achieved when one's access to power, opportunity, and positive outcomes are not predetermined by their racial identity. So this means that race is no longer a predictor in one's ability to have all that they need and more to thrive. We define structural racism as a structure of power that disadvantages people of color and over-advantages white people. People of color is the term that we use on our board and within our organization. We believe that we recognize that it's an imperfect term to describe people who are most affected by racism, but what we've learned is that people's identities are so complex and that people like to define their identities in different ways. So for example, I identify as a Black woman, and I know lots of people who like to identify themselves as African American. I know people who identify as Latino, Latinx, Hispanic. And so we use people of color as a term just to describe people who are most affected. For us, diversity is the first step. And as Jeanette said humorously earlier, it's inviting people to the dance. So it's gathering people with different identities at the table, but people of color assimilate within the existing white culture. And we're going to talk about this more later.
A lot more.
Inclusion is when each individual is able to bring his or her full selves, gifts and skill sets to the table because their access is not limited by race, and there's room for people they don't have to leave pieces of themselves outside of the door and are able to just fully be and not compromise their identity.
Thanks, Tomiko. So now that we've got we've shared with you our common definitions and our framework, we're gonna just make a pass at really talking about why creating a more inclusive and equitable board is important. We see three big reasons, three kind of real buckets about why this is very important and critical work for boards to engage in. The first sort of bucket of reasons is really about efficacy. I think most nonprofit leaders agree that the more we can engage people who are beneficiaries of our work, the more we are likely to create real and lasting change. So as Tomiko and I keep talking about this issue of that race cuts across all social justice issues, this intersectionality between race and other issues means that race places this double jeopardy or triple jeopardy, and it means that at the center of all social issues, the most vulnerable and impacted people are people of color. And so if what we want to do is engage the people most impacted by our work, we have to find ways to engage and amplify the voices of people of color if we hope to be effective. So that captures our efficacy argument. Second, nonprofits are power brokers, and I can't think of anywhere that's more true than here in Western North Carolina. So maybe behind your computer screen you're chuckling. We all know that you can't go too far in Western North Carolina without tripping over another nonprofit, and that's fantastic. The nonprofit sector in Western North Carolina has a lot of opportunity and a lot of voice. Having this power means that we can either reinforce the existing structural racism, or we can be a part of dismantling the existing power structure. We believe as people who are charged with doing good that we have an ethical responsibility to use our power to create real and meaningful change. Thirdly, we think that creating a more inclusive and equitable board is important because racial equity training is excellent professional development for your board, and it will create deeper understanding of the intersectionality of issues and race, not just within your organization or within your sector, but across the lives of your board members. This training has benefits outside of the boardroom. I can speak personally as a white woman that I've been really privileged to participate in the racial equity training that the Asheville City Schools Foundation has worked on now these past 5 years, and it's had profound impacts across my life.
So we created a gradient for an equitable board to help people identify where they are and the different stages their boards might need to move through toward a more equitable board. So these are stuck, warming up, walking, and running. Within each of these stages, we've also identified 4 elements to kind of help people identify the different characteristics and traits that will help them to understand where they are as a board.
Before we show them the elements, I wanted to add just something about why this image works in terms of talking about equity. You know, one reason that this line you can see is going upwards is because working towards equity is an uphill climb. And it's full of, you know, these setbacks and successes and then another setback. So that felt like an important piece of this image. I think maybe also we show along the bottom there that at each one of these stages, the stuck, and then the warming up is really also, we gave you a definition for diversity. Warming up and diversity are a similar stage, walking and inclusion, a similar stage, and then running is when we really see ourselves or our organizations living into that piece of equity. Is there anything else about that image you wanted to say?
Yeah, and in a moment you're going to get to actually hear about Asheville City Schools Foundation journey along this gradient. But the one thing that I think is a really accurate depiction is you'll notice that the line is crooked. And it is a very crooked path in moving a board toward equity. And so I think that Kate has said already that it's not easy work, but the impacts are transformational, both for the organization and for people who are on the board. And I can say this as a person who has experienced my life, and the way I view the world has it will never be the same.
Yeah, that's for sure.
And so back to the elements. Some are self-explanatory, but the board membership is basically who's in the room. The second level is committee structures, policies, and expectations, and I think that is also self-explanatory. The resources area is how resources are raised and allocated, who are the power brokers and decision-making on how the resources are spent, and how are resources valued or not. Lastly, and this one I'm going to explain a little bit more, mission, vision, and impact is basically looking at the external narrative of why the organization is doing the work that it is doing, and the impact that we believe that the organization is having on the people being served. And it also includes the internal stories, the ones that we tell ourselves as individuals and board members about why we are doing the work we are doing and who the people are we are serving. So really this area is an effort to acknowledge that there is a complex social context that we're working within, and that a board is not isolated in a vacuum, that we belong to a greater social structure.
So as we go through the gradient, we'll keep using these 4 board elements to show how a board is transformed as it moves towards equity within each of these 4 elements. I'm going to give you a brief snapshot of the ACSF journey before we go in detail into each of these steps. The Asheville City Schools Foundation began racial equity work explicitly about 5 years ago. In 2013, the Asheville City Schools Foundation had a diverse warming up board. With a grant from the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation, our board first engaged in racial equity training. The board was able to develop a racial equity lens that it really focused on its own work and on the work of the board. And through this racial equity lens, we identified that although we had a diverse board, our board leadership was consistently and exclusively white. That training and identification of this disparity prompted our board to engage in this transformative work that moved us along the gradient towards inclusion. For 18 months, our board studied policies, processes, and expectations, and I will also say that we engaged in some very long meetings. And at the end of that, we really had this clear goal that we would be focused on promoting the recruitment, retention, and leadership of folks with color on our board. By the summer of 2014, our board was dramatically changed, and we were really putting our toe into this inclusion space. Our board had been, we had new organizational resources, new organizational structures, and what was happening on the boards really started to roll out into the whole organization. We released our first racial equity grants for our school-based teams. In 2015, our board created a new strategic plan, and we centered that plan on improving racial equity in our schools. We revised our mission and our vision, and every program had work identified in racial equity. In 2016, our board elected a leadership team, which included a board president and vice president who are people of color. And in 16 years, this is the first time that our executive team included folks of color. Today, we are reflecting and planning and trying to go deeper for next year. We keep looking at alternative structures. We're trying to understand how we can get closer to equity. We know we have a lot of work left to do.
At the stuck phase, we are really talking about a traditional board structure. And the traditional board structure evolved out of a corporate model of decision-making and of processes. So it is important to just kind of think about that as think about that in terms of history and how the board has, the nonprofit board has evolved into what it is today in the traditional sense. So we're going to talk about the 4 different elements. What it looks like at the board membership level is that the board is primarily populated by white people with power and money. And sitting on this board might be viewed as a prestigious opportunity, and board members can expect certain benefits from sitting on the board, which includes access to social capital, increased business, recommendations, recognitions, pats on the back, enhanced networks, and access to power. At the bylaws, committee structures, and expectations level, the board privileges white people with resources. And the meetings might be using Robert's Rules of Order, and include other expectations of participation that advantage people who have had access to these types of training and experience. At the resources level, financial resources are generated by board members through personal means and networks and are allocated with typically little input from the people who are most impacted by the work. So dollars at this level are the most valued board member contribution, and dollars also result in privileges like leadership, recognition, and access to higher level decision making. The culture of the board also might create a high stakes feeling that people are expected to donate at certain levels. At the mission, vision, and impact level, the organization is a helper and operates primarily as a charitable activity of people with power and privilege. And so one thing that I do want to say as we go through the different phases of a board on its journey toward equity, these are not necessarily rigid definitions. And I think through the foundation's work, I've learned that in some areas we are farther along the gradient than others, but these are more broad strokes of ways of analyzing where your board might be at presently today.
Excellent point. So what did the Asheville City Schools Foundation board look like when it was in the stuck stage? Some examples from our story. As I mentioned, our board leadership was entirely white for 16 years. And our constituency, I should mention, we support the Asheville City Schools, and roughly 50% of our students are students of color. So we had this huge disconnect between representation on our board and those folks and families we specifically hoped to support and empower. Our board policies and expectations were really stuck. There was a time when the Asheville City Schools Foundation board met at 7:30 a.m. for a power breakfast meeting before heading to the office. All the committee meetings happened during the workday. Our board operated under our hierarchy, and we used Robert's rules to manage processes in meetings. Really, the purpose of the meeting was to be as quick as possible. I've been to lots of board meetings like this, and I bet some of you have too, where everybody files in, there's a quick line at the coffee, and then there's a reading of committee reports, which are quickly adopted and out the door. And that's what our board meetings looked like when we were really stuck. In the stuck stage, our mission was to promote the success of all Asheville City Schools students by mobilizing the community to support innovative educational activities. What you hear there is that we believed a universal strategy could support the success of all students without understanding the specific needs of the students who were most marginalized. We didn't specifically identify or implement strategies that would really acknowledge that students of color were having a very different experience and being underserved by our district. In preparing for this webinar, I reviewed many years of annual reports to try and discern the stories that we told about our own organization. And I'll say that one of the annual reports from when we were stuck featured prominently on the cover a picture from a golf tournament with a team of 4 white men.
Thanks, Kate. At the warming up stage, at the board level, the board makes room for diversity by including some people of color. And the people of color are expected to represent large parts of the community impacted by the work of the organization. This is to say that the people of color in the room are the spokespeople for their race. And it puts a lot of pressure on the members who are people of color. And I think that this is not, both the stuck and warming up phase, they're not sustainable. It's really difficult to retain board members at this phase. With the bylaws, committee structures, and expectations, people of color are expected to conform to the existing rules with only slight modifications. Perhaps the meeting times have been changed. The rules assume and reward white power and privilege. And really, there's not a whole lot that has changed from the stuck phase. At the resources level, financial resources are most valued by the board, and other contributions, intangible contributions such as perspective, community connections, historical insight, are all viewed as less valuable. People of color at this level are expected to make intangible or tangible financial contributions, and their overall is just an expectation without regard to people's access and differences in means. When allocating resources, the board turns to people of color for limited input, but again, still they are kind of serving as spokespeople for their race. The board likely leans on the organization staff to provide input from the community without actually authentic connection to the community. So there's not really a connection with what's happening at the table with the work that's happening on the ground. At the mission, vision, and impact level, the board has identified the need to hear from marginalized and impacted communities and feels that limited representation on the board is meeting the need. And so many of us have heard people say, well, you know, we have people of color on our board, like the 2 or 3 people of color, and so we're good.
Yep, exactly. I'm sure that the Asheville City Schools Foundation folks said that at some point. So remember that the warming up stage is diversity. It's our kind of picture of diversity. And so it's just the beginning. But beginning has value, because when the Asheville City Schools Foundation was really in this warming up phase, that's when we identified that we really had a problem. We realized that we would try to recruit folks of color to be on our board, but we had this terrible track record of retaining, engaging, and amplifying the voices of people of color on our board. So I want to pause here to just underline that this might be a specific indicator for your nonprofit board too. Do you notice that your board members of color are dropping off? Do they seem less engaged by your current expectations? And is your leadership largely white folks? These might be indications that you're really in this diversity warming up phase. So as a result of our being in the warming up stage, we decided that we really needed to examine practices and policies that limited board participation. And we started to make changes with the low-hanging fruit. So we made board meetings more accessible to families with children and those who might be working during the school day and jobs that didn't allow flexibility. We also decided that Robert's Rules was stifling conversation, and we searched for new methods of decision making. The Asheville City Schools Foundation Board identified that we didn't know the impact that our programs had specifically on students of color. And this was when the board really first identified the need to disaggregate our data by students of color and our white majority students, so we could really be sure that we were trying to have the impact that we hoped. We began to change the way that we viewed our mission, vision, and impact. So remember, I was telling you about our annual report. Well, in this stage, our annual report, our story started to change a little bit. I found that our annual reports in this era did put people of color prominently in the annual report, but they still included that picture from the golf tournament too.
At the walking phase, I think this is where we primarily are as the Asheville City Schools Foundation. And I think that, as I said, it is sometimes fluid. We might have a foot in one place and a foot in the other. But this is primarily where we are as a board and as an organization. So at this phase, the board has a diverse and authentic mix of community members, which include enough people of color that there's actually a diversity of perspectives within the board members of color in the room. And there are people of color in leadership. So these are things to look at within your own board and in your journey down the gradient. If you can see where we are, we're almost moving toward equity. We're close. The rules have been rewritten to remove barriers to participation and engagement. And this includes the structures and times of meetings, the processes for dialogue and decision making. I think that at this phase, the structures are really reflective of the skills, the gifts that people have that they're bringing to the table. Board members are actively at this phase bringing an equity lens to their committee work. So equity is always part of the conversation in the room. There is an expectation that people will disagree and that board meetings will not always be smooth. Discussion, honesty, honest dialogue, and even disagreement are valued. Board meetings start to become a little longer, but the board members are more engaged. And I think that something that's important to note about this is that the feeling in the room is different, much different, because there is an effort to help people to connect and build relationships with the understanding that in order for a group of people with different identities to hold difficult conversations, that the relationships must be built first.
Yeah.
At the resources level, the board understands that equality is not equity, and there is appreciation that different board members will bring different resources to the organization. Board members aren't expected to make uniform commitments of resources, including dollars, time, perspective, and talents. The intangible resources of experience and perspective are valued, and the board is attentive to the input of board members of color who want to find other ways to plug into the work. The board expects the organization to utilize resources with the input of people of color and those who are most impacted by the work. Authentic experiences and knowledge of the community most impacted is present in the room, and so the board is able to verify and really have a true sense of the best use of resources. And the board is less dependent on staff for reporting on community impact. At the mission, vision, and impact level, racial inequities are centered in the strategic planning work and are explicitly addressed by the mission and vision and values. The board actively works to interrupt structural racism by recognizing privilege, power, and oppression, and the lack of neutrality in determining its priorities, which can all make for a long meeting.
Yeah, it makes for very long meetings. So Tamiko and I were noting on the gradient that if we could redesign that image, we would put the stuck phase and the warming up phase pretty close together. Mm-hmm. Because you'll notice between stuck and warming up, there's not a lot of change. The change is really just that we have invited folks to the dance. But between warming up and walking, there is a lot of work to do. There's a lot of space between just inviting people into the room and really creating an inclusive place where people really can bring their whole selves. So our board is so different today than it was a few years ago. And I want to acknowledge that it's hard. I still, both as a white woman who has a lot to learn, as an executive director who has a lot to learn, it is challenging. I feel this tension between what is often thought of as like board best practice and what I'm learning about what it requires our board to look like to truly be inclusive. And that best practice isn't always what we are learning works in an inclusive board. So let me tell you a little bit more about that. And Tamiko's gonna chime in and help me do that. So on our messy and imperfect board, we have sustained an executive team For 3 years, that has included people of color and white folks. So we have power sharing that we're really working on. We have made a commitment as a board to engage in racial equity training at least annually, and we center many of our discussions on equity. In fact, this year our goal as a board was to center every single board meeting on a racial equity conversation.
And can I say that there was a time when there was a disconnect before the racial equity work became institutionalized, where new board members would come on and there would be an assumption that people shared an analysis of what race and racism and racial equity meant. And we found that we actually, that people could get left behind if we didn't make sure that everybody was offered that same opportunity. And so I think that we have grown a lot since we've been able to make sure that everyone has access to that opportunity.
That's such a great point. And that, I think, was a real shift for our organization when we realized that it wasn't something you do one time and you're fixed.
Right.
We realized that we were going to have to make this constant commitment to keep learning and to keep bringing on people into this conversation so they could be full participants. So our membership recruitment process is, you know, as you can imagine, really revamped, very intentional, very thoughtful. We've redesigned our board meetings to increase emphasis on relationship building and engagement for all members. We adopted a consensus-based decision-making model, which I was really afraid of. I think consensus-based, and I thought, oh my gosh, I'm never gonna get home to my kids. And it's true, sometimes meetings can be long, and but it's been so worth it because the level of engagement has increased so much, both from people of color, but equally from our white folks. In general, everybody buys into the idea that these discussions mean something. And there's just this whole sense of everybody in the room really leaning into conversations. We've committed to providing food and childcare at every board meeting. It's not something that people have to sign up for or call ahead about. Everyone knows that they can count on bringing children and having food at the meeting. The board work at this point has really started to transform the organization, or I will say it has transformed the organization. Each program line of the Asheville City Schools Foundation has specific racial equity goals. We measure our work with disaggregated information, so our students of color who are the minority in our schools are not lost in the numbers. We've created racial equity grants to catalyze change in our schools. And we have transformed the way that we see our mission, vision, and impact. We rewrote our mission statement and put racial equity front and center. Now our mission statement reads, we implement bold strategies, fund big ideas, and engage the community to increase excellence with equity. And I think that's significant because what we've learned is that we can't, really addressing these big problems takes boldness and bravery and bigness. And that's what's exciting to me about that mission statement. All that said, we have a long way to go. We recognize that we have so much to learn and so much progress to make. We've noticed that if board members don't participate in the full racial equity training, as Tamiko said, their learning curve really slows down the rest of the board. We still have a challenging time amplifying the perspectives of our board members of color because sometimes these leaders are overburdened with community responsibilities. And we're still working on our culture. We rely on tools that aren't accessible for everyone, like Google Docs. That's my favorite. And sometimes we use too much nonprofit speak. This spring, we're still asking every board member to be a part of fundraising. And at this point on our board culture, that's just become alienating and awkward. And it's something that we're really looking at changing.
So I would like to, there's something that I've noticed, a story I'd like to share about one of our board members who is a person of color, and they actually expressed during a team meeting that they were still, despite all the effort in revamping our structures and processes to make them more equitable. Despite all of this person was still feeling that their skills and their gifts and their interests were not being utilized or recognized. And they were actually considering leaving the board because they felt like they were in the wrong place. And the really awesome thing about this, I think, is one, that this person felt safe enough and comfortable enough to be able to authentically share their experience. And I think also that we are responsive to the needs of the board. And we are actually going to be implementing a new team, community engagement. And I think that this evolved out of this person's experience. And I think that there was a time when this would have potentially not have been, well, spoken, first of all, and then that it would not have been acknowledged, and that the feedback may not have shaped the direction of the work. And so I think that's a really great example of really looking at someone who's so very deeply connected to the community and listening. And so one thing I think that's really important at this level is the need for constant and consistent evaluation and taking what has been learned into moving the work forward.
Yeah, that's a great point.
At the running phase.
Now when we're really hoping that we're running into equity.
And so I will say that, you know, as Kate said earlier, this is a journey, and it is an imperfect journey. The path is crooked, and I've been thinking a lot about what equity means within the context of board culture and board work. And I think it's important to remember that this work is a process and it's not a destination. And I think we tend to think that, oh, I did the training, I'm done, and everything is perfect now. I've arrived. And the truth is that equity, the work toward equity is an ongoing process of, as I mentioned a few moments ago, ongoing evaluation and bringing what has been learned into moving the work forward. We talk about structural racism as a structure, but the truth is that structural racism is actually constantly shape-shifting and in response to the greater social context. And so I think part of racial equity work is being attentive to what is going on in the world around us and recognizing that we're not in a vacuum.
That's such a profound point, and I think, again, this speaks to why sometimes there's this tension between what is kind of a best practice of a board, because those best practices have a sense of timelessness to them, but things keep changing, and conditions, particularly for people of color who are vulnerable and marginalized, are changing dramatically as we speak. And so our boards need to also continue to be responsive.
So at the board membership level, race is not a predictor of who sits on the board or who is in leadership. And the lived experiences and perspectives of people who are most impacted by racism are centered in the work. At the committee structures, policies, and expectations element, committee functions and expectations are actively seeking to utilize the skills and gifts of all the board members and centering the leadership of people who are most impacted by racism. Ongoing exploration of alternative board structures that support community-led and people of color work. And race and racism are unpacked within policy decisions, board practices, and expectations. Racial equity strategies are central to the board's area of work. And I think something that is important that I've noticed in my experience is that we can be very comfortable talking about groups of people of color who experience oppression, but that we're not quite as comfortable talking about whiteness, white access, and white privilege. And so I think at this level, at the running level, people are willing to always look at the whole story, look at the whole picture. So not only talking about the oppression, but also looking at the privilege. So bringing that lens into policy decisions, into, yeah. Would you add anything?
Well, I would just think of a moment that happened in a board discussion recently. And you really pointed it out to me, Tamiko, that there was something voiced on the board, and a white person on the board said, "We have this privilege." They really stated it. We didn't need to wait for a person of color to kind of bring it into the room, that this was a privilege that was reserved for white people. A white person immediately jumped on that and shared and identified white privilege in that case. And that felt like a really exciting shift for our board.
Absolutely. And I think too that for people of color to constantly bringing that perspective into the room can sometimes be burdening and exhausting. And so it's nice for that work to be shared.
Yeah.
At the resources level, fundraising is separate from decision making. Board members actively seek opportunities for investing resources within communities most impacted by racism. And within the context of the organization's area of work, this includes the support of leadership opportunities and professional development, and just general support for leaders of color. So I'll give you an example of this. I think in most of the nonprofits that I've been involved with, and organizations that I've worked within or have relationships with, I think there is a challenge with finding people of color who are willing to sit on financial committees or to be in treasurer positions. And this is like I think not just a Asheville issue, I think this is a national issue. And of course there are exceptions, but one thing that came up in the board in response to this is how about providing some kind of mentoring opportunity for someone who is interested in learning more about being on a financial committee and thinking about how that work can be brought into their lives and into their communities. Another example of resources being invested into communities of color would be, we had a big event recently and hired a photographer who is a person of color, and just looking at little opportunities of investing resources into the community, because usually what happens is, because we all have, people tend to, especially white people, tend to have social circles and connect each other with people that they know for, you know, when there's opportunities for catering, or could you add to that?
Yeah, I think that when our fundraising committee, which is largely composed of white people, sits down to talk about who to hire, to cater, to host the event, what comes to mind is places that we often frequent.
Right.
And so I think when we're getting towards this level of equity, we're really saying to ourselves, we're noticing, we're having this awareness. Wait a minute, there's only white people in the fundraising room here. So of course we're going to tap our white resources. So identifying instead that at every level of conversation, we need to be bringing our racial equity lens to it.
Absolutely. And I think that if this had been a couple years ago, it would have gone unnoticed. And so I think that is an important distinction between the walking and running phases. The mission, vision, impact area, people most impacted by structural racism are determining the priorities of work with the recognition that the expertise of people's lived experiences is key to the development of racial equity strategies into transformative social change efforts. So there is an inherent tension present for groups such as Asheville City Schools Foundation, who are closely tied or work within the confines of an institution or institutional structure. And I think that a lot of nonprofits, with our relationships with institutions, our relationships with funders, there can be a disconnect and a tension that we're doing the best practices, but the best practices are not producing the results that we want to have. We're not achieving equity. And so just acknowledging that there is a tension there, and that it's something that we continue to explore. And as Kate was describing earlier, when we create and implement universal strategies that treat all people as the same, all students as the same, or assuming that they all have access to the same things, we are missing the student who does not have, the student of color who perhaps has a disability. So this is to say that if we don't inform our decision making by that one student in the room who is a student of color and has a disability, so is experiencing that double jeopardy, then they will always go missed. And so I think at this level, at the running level, we are constantly looking for that single person in the room whose needs will always be excluded unless we very intentionally focus our strategies on addressing their needs so they can fully participate.
Yeah, that's great.
So I am going to share a couple examples of boards that are running, or maybe somewhere between, let's see, what is that called? Somewhere between walking and running.
A jog.
A jog, a brisk jog.
These are jogging.
So with my, I work at Center for Participatory Change, and recently the role of the board, the primary role of the board is to develop a membership model. And the reasoning behind the membership model is so that the communities who are most impacted by oppression are actually in decision-making roles, can actually shape and determine the priorities of work, and the staff is actually accountable to the community that's being served. I think the other great thing about having a good number of people of color or people who are representative of the groups that are being served is that we are part of our communities. We are part of our communities that we live in, we work for, and we organize within. And so having people of color in leadership listening to what we believe are the needs that we believe will shape the, let me rephrase this, that will shape the future that we want to see. In order for us to be able to create the world that we want to see, people of color need to be at the table equally in our work toward equity. And so another example that I'll give of a board that is jogging, a brisk jog, is a Southeast regional organization of artists and cultural workers called Alternate Roots. And one thing that the Alternate Roots Executive Committee engages in every time there is a meeting, there are 4 quarterly face-to-face meetings, and the meetings always begin with some type of racial equity process, and this helps us to keep the racial equity lens centered in our work for the day, or our work for the weekend.
That's awesome.
Another area, well, to give you a sense of the representation of people of color on the board of CPC, or Center for Participatory Change, we have youth, we have people of color, we have people who speak different languages, we have people of different genders, and I think that the more deeply we get into equity, the more we are moving toward running, the more our lens for equity becomes intersectional, because we recognize that people's identities are complex and that we belong to many of us belong to different groups that experience oppression. I'll share CPC's mission, which is igniting collective power, transforming systems of oppression, and healing in community. And this mission statement emerged from the people who are most affected by racism.
That's great. Thank you. So we're going to move into talking about action steps and how we hope you take this information today and join us in moving forward. We recommend that you use this tool to identify your board's location on the racial equity gradient. We think that if you examine your own board elements for membership, structures, policies, and expectations, resources, and mission, vision, and impact, you will be able to hopefully place yourself. And as we've talked about before, you might find that you've made a lot of progress in one of those elements and that you still have a lot of work to do in another one of the elements. So work to find your board's place on the racial equity gradient. Secondly, we recommend that all boards need to engage in racial equity training together to learn how it impacts our work and our lives. That shared understanding, that shared framework, shared definitions, there just isn't a shortcut to getting that work done. And as we've mentioned, it's not something you're just going to be able to do once. It's something that boards have to commit to making as an ongoing process. And that's really difficult. We just acknowledge that. It's taken a huge commitment on the part of our board, and it's not easy. We do think that you could identify some low-hanging fruit by analyzing one piece of a board element that you think you could make better. For instance, the time of your meetings, the kinds of supports that you provide. Maybe it's the request that you're making of your boards in terms of time, talent, or resources. Maybe there's something that you can shift there that could really make more space for people of color on your board. Finally, we really ask that you commit to learning more and talking with your board. This is a long process, and we really invite you to join us on the journey.
And I'll say about that too is that, you know, we've talked some about what we think racial equity looks like within the context of a board and organization, but really we, because we do not live in a place where, or a society where structural racism doesn't exist, we don't know what it looks like to live in a world where there is no oppression of people. And so it requires us to be able to use our imaginations and to be willing to walk the crooked path. And I think, as both Kate and I have said today, it is a lifelong process. It's a lifelong journey. The more I learn, the more I learn that I need to learn more.
We want to acknowledge that there's some really smart people, including this person sitting next to me, Tomiko Ambrose Murray, who have put together some fabulous tools that the Asheville City Schools Foundation has been able to learn so much from. Open Source Leadership Strategies, Craig White Consulting, and the Center for Participatory Change all have added so much to the Asheville City Schools Foundation's understanding of what we need to do and where we need to go. We would like to open it up to your questions at this time. We see that there's a few in our inbox now, and we're going to open those up and do our best to answer them. Let's see. We're reading your questions. Just for a minute, bear with us. We've got a few. So I'm going to put two together here, which is that the staff understands the need for diversity, but maybe the board leadership isn't quite there yet. It's similar to another question where somebody is asking, how could we help our board get more open to uncomfortable conversations? Because those things go hand in hand. So staff understands the need for diversity and equity, but the board isn't quite there. The board wants to have smooth and easy conversations. So how do we get our boards moving? I think one way would be to go back to that argument about efficacy. And that's a scary thing for a staff member to do, to suggest to their board that they might not be as effective as they want to be. But I think when we disaggregate our data for our boards and talk about the need to authentically learn from the community that we're hoping to serve and partner with, we can make an argument to our board that it's worth it to engage in this difficult work. What do you think? How could staff get a board moving, Tomiko?
Well, actually, it's interesting because, Kate, we were just talking about this a couple days ago when the staff and board are in different places, because I think one thing that can happen is that the board can engage in the work of racial equity and the staff can be left behind, or vice versa. And so the disconnect, I think, is challenging. I think it's important to remember that people who are, or boards and organizations that are in a stuck place are often without knowledge that they're stuck. So they might not actually notice that the only folks in the room all look like each other. And so I think that one thing that, and maybe Kate, you can share a little bit more about this, what I've noticed is that usually what propels people from being stuck to wanting to learn a tiny bit or being willing to engage in a little conversation is there's some kind of incident that takes place that makes people recognize that there's some kind of disparity here. And so I'm wondering if the person who posed that question might think about what has happened that has led the staff to want to pursue learning more about this work, and perhaps thinking about ways to engage the board through sharing that actual experience.
Yeah, it's great. I think one of the questions that we knew that would come up is, what advice do we offer for organizations that are located in rural areas where there are fewer people of color? We knew that that question would come up. You know, of course, there's lots of different kinds of ways that you can increase listening to folks who are marginalized. Tomiko and I both talked about that there are so many different kinds of diversity and so many different voices that need to be heard at the table. But even when there aren't, I guess I'm going to go into uncharted territory here for a second. I think even if there aren't very many folks of color in your community, it's still essential that you find an authentic way to hear from them. And that really could mean stretching your idea about what it means to be on your board. I think this goes back to the idea that we think that board membership implies a certain checklist of things, and that we probably need to change that checklist so that even when there are very few folks, we can be sure we are hearing from them. And just to underscore the point too, that particularly if the people of color in your community are a very small part of your population, then we can be sure that they are very marginalized. And then the need to hear from them is even greater. Do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, and I would say that, I've done some work in some of the surrounding rural communities of WNC, and I am not sure that I've ever been to one where there's not a population of people of color. And I think that something that is important to remember is that it all begins with relationship. And so just thinking about where is it that people of color, where are the churches? Where are the where are the places that people of color go in your community? And I think that that is something that is only going to be answered by the people in your community, and not by Kate and myself. And I think it just, like Kate was saying, it requires a stretch. It requires some research, some learning, some building connections with people who do have relationships with people of color. And I think, yeah, would you say, Kate, like, how would you talk about expanding your social capital, your social connections from primarily white people to including plenty of people of color?
Yeah. So that's a great question. I mean, what I was thinking of when you were saying going to the places where people of color are, I think in most communities, even in the far out rural communities, which are have small populations of color, there's still places that people of color go to shop that other people don't go as often, or to worship, or to even to acquire other services. I think, yeah, I think here in Asheville, and in Buncombe County, personally, it's been much easier to make my life more integrated. And that has looked like not just trying to do that as a method of service, but as a method of just getting to know the people that I live with. But we honor that it's challenging and that it's going to take some work. Let's see. We're going to try and move on to some other questions. So just want to honor again, I'm seeing like a bunch of questions. Yes, there's lots of different kinds of diversity. Yes, you should diversify by age and ability and gender and all of those things. And again, race cuts across all of those issues. Somebody asked, did the time change of the board meetings help people of color participate? Yes, that's an easy one to answer. Definitely. Change just those easy things, making our boards different times, less frequent. There's something to consider. Longer meetings that meet less frequently, that include food. Those things all helped improve access for folks of color.
And I think too, just thinking about how some people can show up in a board meeting and actually include it as part of their work. So technically being paid for being there. And some people have jobs where it makes it impossible for them to participate if it's during the work day.
Sure.
So just, yeah, listening to your board members.
All right, so we're going to try and touch on a really difficult one, which is about fundraising. So somebody asked, regarding fundraising, have you talked about having the board members offer a gift that is personally meaningful without naming an amount? Yes, we tried that. That's what we say we do right now. This person, the question goes on to say, it seems important that everyone is offering some financial support in addition to time and talent. That is board best practice. That is sort of the common thing that we say about boards, and I think I'm beginning to challenge that assertion. I don't know that what we should ask of people is for money. I wonder whether money means that you are more bought in. I think that it's possible that people who are working hard, who are experiencing oppression and challenge, that the fact that they're showing up at meetings regularly and offering their perspective is more valuable than any financial donation I could ask them for. So I'm challenging that. We don't know where we're going with that. We're trying to figure it out, right, Tamiko? We don't have an answer, but I will say that we are beginning to challenge that idea that there needs to be a gift from every person on the board.
And I think that something that is important to remember too is that looking at learning more about structural racism and how it operates, and that if financial contributions is a barrier to people being able to participate, if they don't have the money to contribute, like literally do not have the money to contribute, but are brilliant and have amazing experience, amazing ideas, and have earned in other ways the trust of the board and of the organization. And I think that having money as treating financial resources as a barrier, I think that is a low-hanging fruit. And it's not viewed as best practice, but I agree with Kate that we should continue challenging it. And that, and just remembering also that nonprofits did evolve out of corporate culture. And so that's ultimately where the best practice evolved from over time.
So Tamiko and I could get pretty passionate about this topic. I'll just add that I think even the fact, even if when we say to board members, make a gift that is personally meaningful, I think what we're entering into the room is that this is the way that we measure, this is the way that you show your commitment. I think it makes financial resources in the board space important enough that it's going to be obvious. I mean, how does that feel then to the person on the board who can't make a significant gift? I mean, we've bent over backwards on our board to say whatever gift is meaningful to you, but really how does that feel to board members for whom making a meaningful gift is going to be significantly less than the person sitting next to them? I don't know how we can take it out of that context that board members are sitting next to each other and we're asking them to basically reaffirm their inequity in some ways. We're asking them to show up with that disparity. So I don't know, we should probably move off it, but Tamiko and I could talk about that a long time.
Here's an easy one. What are good resources for racial equity training? And I would say open source technology has a really great training.
Leadership, open source leadership.
Open source leadership.
Yeah. All right. Oh, sorry.
And it's actually listed at the end of the PowerPoint.
Yeah, and I know you'll have access to the PowerPoint, so that's a great place. We recommend Center for Participatory Change. We know we have to wrap it up. Let's see, there's a question. I am an African-American woman who is serving on some community boards. Initially, I was hesitant, but became a convert when some of the issues related to people of color on the board were connected to the needs of all board members. I'm sure that changing the expectation that board members financially give will help many whites as well as people of color on the board. It is important to remember that not all Black people are poor. It bothered me to think that people of color do not do Robert's rules. We are as much in need of structure as others. Excellent points.
Yeah. And I'll speak to, let's see here. I really appreciate the recognition that, oops, where'd the question go? I really appreciate the recognition that, one, that having people of color on the board and is benefiting white people as much as it's benefiting people of color.
Yeah.
So I think that's another example of where
She put answered, so it's gone.
Oh no, okay, sorry, we are addressing your question from memory. And so I'll say to the person who was addressing Robert's Rules of Order and the need for people of color to learn that kind of structure. And what I'll say is that one of the boards that I am responsible for convening with Asheville Writers in the Schools and Community, our board is made up primarily of people of color. And we do have white people on the board, but it's primarily people of color, Black and Latino. And one thing that we have learned is that even if there are no white people in the room, that there can still be traits of structural racism present in the room. And so we're not talking about race as necessarily just as an identity. We're talking about these systems and structures that were built long before any of us were born, that were created to perpetuate racial disparities. And there's a long history behind that, but I think it's important and so to connect that back to Robert's Rules is born of corporate culture, which is a structure that continues to perpetuate disparities. And so while there is a structure, I think it limits people from being able to really reflect to be able to use their voice in response to the different decisions that come to the table that require intricate reflection. And I think Robert's Rules is very confining, and again, that it perpetuates disparities.
I think that's all the time that we have. Yeah, I think that was great. And we're so appreciative of Nonprofit Pathways for offering us this opportunity, and for all of you 59 folks who hung in there with us. We just want to acknowledge again what a difficult topic this is to talk about in such a confined amount of time, and also with this particular platform. But we know that this is an important conversation, and we just have to start somewhere. So thank you all for being a part of it, and thanks to Nonprofit Pathways.
Thank you, Tamiko and Kate, for your presentation today. I think we could obviously talk for hours, and this is obviously a conversation that needs to happen. And we appreciate you sharing your experiences and all that you've learned along the way with us. And thank you to everybody who's joined us. Whether you find your organization on the gradient of an equitable board at the beginning or further along, we hope that you now have some new strategies to take back to your organization and help you along the journey.